Okay, I'm going to pull these frets out, and I'm going to try without heat to start with, just to see how much they resist it. Yeah, there's absolutely no concern there. That came out really nicely. I probably say this in every single video, but the number one rule with this is do not rock the fret rockers. You've got to just inch along and let them do the work. As soon as you start sort of rocking the fret rockers back and forth, you're going to pull rosewood up. Just a little bit of rosewood pull up there. Probably not enough to be concerned about, but let's minimize the amount that we lose. We are going to give this board a good old blocking to make sure that it's really, really flat and perfectly even radius, which it certainly isn't at the moment. I've done a quick measure. If you can't get the sort of I guess jaws of the nipper underneath, what I do is I just squeeze the fret and pull it upwards really slightly, just jiggling slightly until I can get the edge under. There you go. And as soon as the jaw gets under, it does that real gentle lifting of the fret, and also, most importantly, the actual jaws themselves hold down the wood either side of where the tang is being pulled out, and they really help minimize tear out. So you can see this is very, very close to being done. Just these little dark areas here to get down to. Okay, I decided to stop there with the block. Actually, there was just still a little bit over here, and it was probably getting on for just over 1/4 mil deep, which doesn't sound that deep, but you've got to bear in mind that you've got to remove 1/4 mil from the entire board. Now, I've got no issue in doing that, of course. It's not a sort of a time thing, but if you look at this inlay here, this little bit of pearl is pretty dark. Now, I've looked back at pictures of when I first started working on this, and it is pretty dark, but so it could just be the colouring of that pearl. I've definitely had that before, but it could also be that this is getting like a little bit too thin, and I don't want to take that risk. Now, if I have to replace this little bit of inlay, then so be it. That's of course what we'll do. But the most important thing when you're leveling a fretboard actually is to make sure that the area where the frets are going to sit is completely level. And if there's a divot between those two, as was the case here, you can hide it, from the eye by just sort of smoothing it out. And you won't feel it really with the hand, especially when it's up there, like unless you're kind of hooking your thumb over, you tend not to sort of touch too much of that bit of the fretboard. But yeah, it was just one of those sort of judgment calls I decided to make, and I think ultimately it's the right one. So the final step before the refret is just to take the corners off these slots. Just to stop chip out from happening. Just going to put a small amount of beeswax wood polish on these frets, and really trying to avoid the fret slots themselves. But what we want to do is essentially protect the rosewood from the super glue we're going to use. So if we do get glue, it's just going to peel off. We're now in a really good position to start putting the frets in. So I've radiused this wire to pretty much bang on 12. Like normally I'd go a little bit over, but I feel actually it's going to be beneficial not to in this instance. Cut it a bit long now. And I'm just going to put in a real small bead of glue just to make sure that these are real nice and set down. Real nicely firmly held in the slots. Okay, while that one sets up, we'll just measure our next one and repeat. I'm just going to clamp this guy on here, just to apply a little bit of downward pressure just in the middle of those frets. So the frets are in. I've just clipped off the ends of the frets with flat cut nippers. And the final thing I'm doing is just filing these fret ends so they're completely dead on flat with the sort of purfling and the edge of the fretboard. And after a bit of experimentation, I found that actually a fret end file is the best thing. This is actually one from Crimson Guitars, and I really love this file. I use it for loads and loads of things. Funnily enough, not fret ends. I still think that the StewMac one is a bit more delicate, but this one is amazing for things like nuts and just jobs like this. It's just a really nice file. And I'm just sort of applying a little bit of pressure sort of at the bottom with my thumb, just to make it sort of nice, and we don't want to sort of tip the fret inwards. I want to make it nice and flush, and really importantly, vertical. And just occasionally I'm stopping and checking the binding against it and making sure that that's looking good. That one is sticking out ever so slightly. That's good. That's good. I think that is probably good. Now, the fun bit is laminating this binding. So what we're going to do is just tape this guy down here, and I'm just going to put a little bit of CA glue. This is the thin stuff. A little bit of that there. We carry on at intervals down the binding until we're all glued up like this. So I definitely haven't mastered laminating binding yet, but what I feel I've done pretty well is the art of trimming that binding once it's actually laminated. And the trick is you just run it over carefully, an upturned plane, and it'll trim it so it's nice and flush. Okay, sometimes in life I'm just going to jump into these things, so I've done a quick dry run here. The slight complication we have here is that because this is higher than the fretboard, you can't really sort of crank it in. The problem is if you pull this way, what it does is it lifts this sort of like this front corner here. So I feel like we need a combination of just like CA glue, accelerator, fingers, and binding tape. Just going to push that down and set it off. A slight change of plan because the binding wasn't really going on in the way that I wanted it to. I'm using the other approach, which is really common with this stuff, which is just to basically paint some acetone in there. And part of the advantage of this is that it helps mold the bottom of the binding to the channel. So even if the channel is, you know, slightly off square, the binding will sort of comply to it. Whereas what I was finding was if there was any slight imperfection in either the binding or the channel itself, the binding wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. This is really good though. And just do a little section at a time. I want to get really straight edge on the binding, but I also want to sort of give it a good press against the fret ends. So what I'm doing here is, with the binding not, it's nice and sort of dry at the moment, there's not a huge amount of acetone on it, if any. I'm just putting some clamps on that will kind of reference the edge of the fretboard, and then I'm just going to paint down the whole length with some acetone again.